was exclusive from 1912 to 1922, becoming well known for his early work in fantasy and science fiction covers. Many of these popular pulps featured stories by classic writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs, creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, Max Brand, creator of Dr. Kildare, Clarence E. Mulford, creator of Hopalong Cassidy, and Johnston Macaulay, creator of Zorro. Johnston Macaulay was born on February 2, 1883, in Ottawa, Illinois. He began his career as a police office reporter for the Police Gazette and later served as an Army Public Affairs officer during World War I. He would later work in pulps, creating numerous heroes that would later inspire the mass superheroes in comic books. The most famous was Zorro, who first appeared in the story of The Curse of Capistrano in 1919 in All Story Weekly. The character was a mass vigilante Zorro set in Pueblo of Los Angeles during the Spanish California, which took place between 1769 and 1821. His real identity was Don Diego de la Vega, a rich landowner. Of course, Zorro would go on to be a popular fictional character in his own right, with numerous TV shows, movies, and comic books based on him, but he was also a chief inspiration for one of comic books' greatest characters, Batman. According to Batman's co-creator Bob Kane, he was a huge fan of Zorro and drew heavy inspiration from him when crafting Batman. Kane would point out the obvious similarities, which them both being rich playboys while fighting crime as masked vigilantes dressed in black, complete with expert acrobatic and combat skills. They both even had a secret lair in a cave under their mansion. Macaulay would also create other masked vigilantes in pulps like the Thunderbolt, Crimson Cowl, and Black Star. He even created a supervillain in the Spider, all of whom would serve as inspiration for future comic book superheroes. Macaulay passed away on November 23, 1958 at the age of 75 in Los Angeles, California. His creation Zorro remains as popular as ever, outshining him to the point that many have forgotten that he is a writer and that Zorro originally started as a pulp character. For the color artist, Walter Baumhofer was also known as the King of Pulps, most famous for his Doc Savage covers. He started with the Danger Trail, providing his first covers and interior art. Another of the pulp writers was Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was born on September 1st of 1875 in Chicago, Illinois. After serving in the U.S. Cavalry and enlisting in spring of 1896, he went through numerous failed careers, despite having to support a wife and 3 children. Thus, at the age of 37, he submitted Under the Moon of Mars about a Southern American Civil War veteran who finds himself transported to Mars, where he encounters the 4-armed, 8-foot-tall Green Man while falling in love with Dejah Doris, the Princess of Mars, while fighting to save her kingdom and fighting off barbarian invaders. He even has super strength and leaping abilities thanks to Mars' lower gravity, something that would inspire the original creation of Superman, who at first just leaped tall buildings in a single bound before he learned to fly. The story first appeared in All Story magazine on February-July of 1912 and was greeted a huge success. Burroughs followed with Tarzan of the Apes, appearing in All Story in October of 1912, about the son of an English lord raised as a baby by apes in the African jungle after his parents were killed. The rest was history, and soon Burroughs was the highest-paid writer in the world, earning thousands of dollars off the sequels of his works. He would soon be known as ERB, and with his new fortune, Burroughs started his own publishing company, Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, profiting from the 1930s and 40s off both his new books and reprints of the originals. Burroughs then moved to California in 1918, purchasing a large ranch in the San Fernando Valley, which he aptly named Tarzana. A few years later, he broke up the ranch into subdivisions, selling the property in sections that will eventually become the town Tarzana. Burroughs would later create a third character, David Enns, who traveled beneath the earth and would even cross over with Tarzan and Tarzan at the Earth's core, a crossover before comic books ever did it. Burroughs would next create Carson Napier, who crash lands on Venus, finding himself captured by pirates while trying to get back to Earth, first appearing in the pulp Argosy in 1934. Burroughs' stories were also published in pulps like Amazing Stories and Fantastic Adventures, and he was so popular with readers that his name on the cover guaranteed 15,000 in extras issues sales. In addition, his characters were an enormous influence for both writers and storytellers, as John Carter was also a chief influence for Star Wars as well as Superman. When Burroughs' novels were later reprinted in 1962, it resulted in $10 million in sales, representing 1/30th of all paperback sales of that year. Edgar Rice Burroughs died in March of 1950 at the age of 74, with his final resting place naturally being in Tarzana, California. Today, he is remembered as one of the greatest science fiction and adventure writers of all time, and no less than Ray Bradbury calling him one of the most influential writers in the entire history of the world. The mystery genre of pulps began in Detective Story magazine from Street and Smith, published on October 5th of 1915. The first magazine dedicated to mystery stories. The magazine evolved out of Nick Carter's stories, which was his original a nickel weekly pamphlet with a novel-length feature as its main attraction. Bumping the page count to 128 to be in line with the rest of Pulps, Detective Story magazine was edited by Frankie Blackwell, who preferred Poe-like stories, many written by Johnston McCulley. Many of Detective's covers were by John Albert Coughlin for the first 2 decades, though the painter, who also worked for slicks like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post, was rather boring. The magazine lasted to the summer of 1949 with a run of 1,057 issues and is mostly known for its straight mystery stories. This would all change for the genre with Black Mask, which emphasized the hard-boiled stories from writers like Raymond Chandler in Blackmailers Don't Shoot in December of 1933. Chandler, who was a former oil executive who was 44-year-old when he submitted the story, soon changed the detective genre. Black Mask was originally covered many other genres such as adventure and westerns before going all detective stories in 1932. The pulp began back in April of 1920 under Joseph T. Shaw, George G. Nathan, and H.L. Mencken. Nathan and Mencken were editors of Smart Set, a high-toe magazine with lofty intentions but low sales. But they had also managed to produce some money with racier pulps like The Parisian and Saucy Stories. With the success of those pulps, they decided to add a third, being Black Mask, which originally covered all kinds of stories from adventure to romance. By the end of the year, Nathan and Mencken sold Black Mask for $12,500 off their original $600 investment, and under the new leadership, it would change along with the detective genre in general. In Volume 5, Number 9, on December of 1922, hard-boiled detective fiction with stories like False Bottom Combs about a gentleman adventurer assigned to protect the rich man's son by Carol John Daly, and The Roadhouse, detective in which a detective is tasked with taking a criminal from the Central American jungles back to New York by Peter Collinson, a.k.a. Dashiell Hammett, whose first ever published story appeared in the Smart Set just 2 months earlier. Both stories featured tough talk and fast action over character and story, and the lead character who lives his life by his own rules, which would become the hallmark of hard-boiled detective stories. Race Williams, the gentleman adventurer of False Button Combs, would be a frequent star of the daily stories, often addressing the reader directly with tough-talking observations and philosophy. Hammett, of course, would go on to write the classic The Thin Man and the Maltese Falcon stories, considered modern classics in the detective fiction genre. Between these two, they set an example that changed detective stories from just mystery-solving puzzles to character and atmosphere that has carried on to this day. Look no further than Frank Miller's Sin City as an example. Black Mask would run until 1951, and its legacy of hard-boiled crime fiction remains to this day. In fact, the working title of Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, the classic film that embodied numerous hard-boiled crime stories, was called Black Mask as in honor of the magazine that inspired the genre of storytelling. Another detective series was Flynn Weekly, which later became Flynn's Weekly Detective Fiction, emphasized traditional mysteries over the hard-boiled ones in Black Mask. Soon, subgenres in pulps would spring up, such as Underworld magazine on May of 1927, the first gang pulp. It would be followed by Gun Balls, Greater Gangster Stories, and the Dragnet magazine. However, by 1935, this subgenre fizzled with the end of Prohibition and much of the gang warfare that went with it. The sports genre was another significant, though not as big, set of pulp magazines, such as Dime Sports, which started in July of 1935, 2 months after the legendary Babe Ruth ended his baseball career, and it would run to 1934 with 1,054 issues. It would be preceded by Sports Story magazine, which was released only twice monthly and began back in 1923. The pulp featured fiction and nonfiction stories before regular sports magazines, while the covers were more realistic and emotional. Sports Story enjoyed virtual dominance in the market until Dime Sports was published, leading to an onslaught of sports pulps, including news sports and sports novels. Ultimately, sports would not be as successful as other pulp genres, with most of the readers being young boys who eventually grew out of the stories. Plus, due to its content, neither the stories nor the covers were as exciting or fantastical as the other genres, such as horror or science fiction. Street and Smith did produce Sports Story, which ran for 429 issues until 1943 and would cover all sports at first. However, by 1930s, it focused mainly on baseball and football and would feature authors like Max Brand, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian. Romance pulps would tie with westerns as one of the most popular in the genre, running from 1912 to 1971, with 139 separate titles and as many as 20 being published at one time. A notable one was Love Story magazine in 1921 by Street and Smith, and by 1929 it reached 600,000 in sales before ending in 1947. By 1938, there were 19 romance titles along with 11 Western romance titles like Love Book Magazine, Popular Love, Thrilling Love, and 1924's Ranch Romances, which is a new sub-crossover genre with Westerns. The covers and the stories will evolve over time from the 1920s featuring meek women to by the late 30s they were employed strong women. In the 1940s, as part of World War II, many of the women were depicted in uniform on the cover. Some of the covers were more risque for the time, whether depicting a woman in a passionate kiss with a man or laying allurely on a grassy field, but never straying too far lest they would be labeled as spicy or sexy pulp, i.e. softcore porn. Modest Stein did nearly every cover for Love Story, with especially being beautiful women. Female artists were especially prevalent in this romance genre, with some notable ones being Madge Geyer, Gloria Stoll, and Zena Wright. However, they weren't just artists but also editors, as with Daisy Bacon, who edited Love Story magazine from 1928 to 1947, originally getting a job answering an ad for an editorial assistant in February of 1926. She was first put in charge of the Friends in Need advice column, with numerous others she read from Love Story's readers giving her insight into what stories they liked. By 1928, Bacon was made editor and quickly gained a reputation for knowing what the readers wanted from the experience. Under Bacon, the Love Story magazine focused on modern working girls who found love during their story, but not at the sacrifice of the story itself. In fact, Bacon stated a good love story doesn't necessarily need the romance element. Outspoken in public, Bacon could be considered a feminist for her time, as she frequently spoke to newspapers about women's issues and the inability to shatter the glass ceiling in pursuit of their careers. Bacon's sister Esther would join her on Love Story in 1929 until it ended in 1947. While at Street and Smith, Bacon also edited The Shadow, Doc Savage, Smart Love Stories, and Detective Stories before publishing company ended Pulps altogether. Bacon later published Love Story Writer in 1954, a guide on how to write a romance story. She died in 1986 at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy of one of the most talented writers and editors of the pulp era. And I will leave you here for now, but join me again next week when we continue in this history of pulp magazines, covering the other genres is horror, science fiction, and of course the one that will have a heavy influence on American comic books, the hero genre. And now it is February 27th, 2020, time for the favorite comic book of the week, Batman, Curse of the White Knight, number 7 by Sean Murphy, which finds the Batman after finding out the ramifications of the real history of the Bruce Wayne family, makes a fateful decision about being Batman, all while finding a way to finally take down Azrael. Sean Murphy crafts another great story that finds new twists in terms of the whole Batman, Bruce Wayne mythos, especially with supporting the cast, and an interesting development with Harley Quinn, all while delivering some dynamic art that's easily one of the best-looking Batmans ever, along with a great Azrael and some killer action scenes. This is easily one of the best Elseworlds, DC Black Label books in years, and a perfect sequel to Batman the White Knight, which is easily one of the best Batman books in recent years. A great read from beginning to end, and perfect for any Batman fan. And speaking of Batman, I mentioned the last episode that I was playing the Batman Telltale games, and it finished it up because thankfully those Telltale games are pretty quick to play, and it's a very fun game. Takes some twists and turns I wasn't too fond of. They take some liberties with the Thomas Wayne and so forth like that, but overall, a very solid adaptation, very fun for the point-and-click genre. And I'll definitely be kicking up the Batman The Enemy Within, which is about to go free on Xbox Live next month, if you're a gold member. All that said, pretty good Batman stuff out right now. And join me again next week when I'll be concluding this two-parter on the history of pulps. Till then, go out and enjoy yourself a good comic book.